Ruby rocked the first chapter because of its ability to control the board and keep games from getting too carried away before coming back and taking the victory. Cards like Be Prepared, Maui Hero to All, and Pongo were all staple cards that showcase the primary identities found in Ruby for the first chapter. Ruby excels at keeping control of the board through direct removal, challenging, and stealing the win with sneaky, evasive questers. These identities were expanded upon and completely new ones were added in Rise of the Floodborn, so join me as I tell you why you should play Ruby in Rise of the Floodborn. Ruby's been one of the best inks to utilize for control decks because of its access to direct removal. Cards like Dragonfire, Maleficent Monstrous Dragon, and Be Prepared were staples in the first chapter for this reason. These were red emergency buttons you could almost always press if you needed to get rid of a threat right now. In Rise of the Floodborn, we get even more cards with these effects with the most diabolical scheme that lets you banish one of your villains to banish a chosen character, and Namari Nemesis, which lets you banish another character after she exerts and banishes herself. Admittedly, these cards aren't the best because most Diabolical Scheme will always be a 2-for-1 trade, and Namari can be banished before she's able to use her ability. On the other hand, we also got Lady Tremaine Imperious Queen that made waves in Ruby because of her power to rule at last ability that says when you play this character, each opponent chooses and banishes one of their characters. At first, this might not seem all that strong considering you can play Dragonfire a turn earlier and choose who is banished, but here's some things to think about. With Lady Tremaine at 6 ink and Be Prepared at 7 ink, your opponent could be caught in a real catch-22 scenario because if they play multiple characters to avoid having a single character banished with Lady Tremaine, they could be punished a turn later with Be Prepared. Also, being able to develop a 3-4 body with 2 lore while banishing an opposing character for only 1 extra ink is a lot of value compared to Dragonfire. Even though the opponent choosing which character is banished seems like a bad thing, it can actually be really valuable because this actually gets around Ward. Ward specifies that opponents can't choose that character except a challenge. It doesn't say anything about your opponent forcing you to choose a character. It also makes for a really good follow-up to Be Prepared in case your opponent tries to play a single valuable character. If you play Be Prepared and they follow up with a bomb drop, you can simply play Tremaine and then they're back to square one. Because of all of the options to keep your opponent's board relatively small and the constant threat of Be Prepared if they go too wide, Lady Tremaine becomes a really valuable card to add to the mix and keep your opponents on their toes. In the first chapter, we also had cards like Mulan Imperial Soldier and Aladdin Heroic Outlaw that gave big benefits once they banished a character they challenged. And with cards like Maui Hero to All and LeFou Instigator, challenging is a big part of Ruby's identity. In Rise of the Floodborn, we got even more characters that give you benefits for not just challenging and banishing other characters, but also simply challenging them as well. This strategy got lots of support in Rise of the Floodborn with cards like Scar Vicious Cheater, Queen of Hearts Sensing Weakness, Shere Khan Menacing Predator, and Raya. Shere Khan has an ability that gains you lore every time a character challenges another character, and Queen of Hearts has a similar ability that lets you draw a card every time you challenge a character. You can see how quickly this can snowball when one or both of these are on board. Pairing these cards with Scar, Raya Headstrong, and Raya Leader of Heart adds a lot of synergy to the whole challenging package. Both Raya Headstrong and Scar Vicious Cheater can get multiple challenges off in a turn because they each ready if they banish another character in a challenge. Raya Leader of Heart can't challenge multiple times in a turn, but can challenge without fear of repercussions because of her ability to take no damage when she challenges a damaged character. Using these characters paired with other Ruby cards that'll ready your characters lets you make the most out of Shere Khan and Queen of Hearts by no longer having to give up opportunity costs to challenging and questing. In fact, readying characters is another identity we see in Ruby that directly synergizes with its challenging theme. We can see it both in Scar and Raya, but there are also cards like Go the Distance and Ratigan Very Large Mouse. You know what's better than challenging one character? Challenging two. And that's what Go the Distance effectively lets you do. You can challenge an opposing character, putting damage on your own character, allowing you to use Go the Distance to ready them and challenge again if you want. Ratigan Very Large Mouse says when you play this character, exert chosen opposing character with 3 strength or less, then choose one of your characters and ready them. They can't quest for the rest of the turn. Ratigan does a lot of work basically setting everything up for you. You can exert a low cost character if they aren't already, and then ready a character so they can challenge. He is uninkable but has relatively high lore, so while you use your other characters to challenge and banish, Ratigan can quest away. One of the things that makes Disney Lorcana such a great game in my opinion is the constant decision tree you're faced with in every game. Your character can usually quest, challenge, sing, or use their ability, but normally you can only do one of those things with them during a turn. While challenging, you're slowing down your opponent from reaching their win condition of gaining 20 lore, but you're also not getting any closer to 20 lore yourself. By questing, you're progressing your win condition, but leaving yourself vulnerable to your opponent. You're constantly having to make decisions on what to do with your characters, giving up the opportunity cost of doing the other things in return. That's what makes makes this package so fun and enticing in my opinion. With Sheer Con and a couple extra pieces, you don't have to give up any opportunity costs between questing and challenging. You can both slow your opponent down and progress your win condition at the same time. We saw this a bunch with Aladdin Heroic Outlaw in the first chapter. There were some other cards that did similar stuff, but Aladdin was the one who saw the most play. I feel like now with the addition of all these challenge-oriented cards, this theme in Ruby really got a boost. It's a super fun strategy to build around if you ever get the chance. I'll warn you that it isn't the most consistent strategy because unless you play cards that force your opponent to exert their characters, a lot of times they can just play characters and keep them ready to avoid the challenge. And I won't mention all the bounce shenanigans and amethysts that let them quest and then remove characters so that you can't challenge them. I went over all of that in my last Why You Should Play video that you should check out after this one if you're interested. But regardless, it's a very fun strategy to build around and rewarding when you manage to get some wins with it. In the first chapter, we also had a lineup of daring, difficult to catch, evasive characters with Pongo, Old Rascal, Goofy Daredevil, Tigger Wonderful Thing, and the main mouse himself, Mickey Brave Little Tailor. These are all simple yet effective cards because of their evasive keyword, making it difficult to banish them and keeping them from gaining lore. Pongo more than any of the other cards saw play because he was cheap, inkable, and gained 2 lore every turn unless your opponent had an answer. In Rise of the Floodborn, Ruby gets even more evasive support, but this time not entirely through characters. Cards like You Can Fly and Peter Pan's Dagger show up in Ruby with evasive synergy by giving you the ability to give a character evasive until the start of your turn, or give your characters with evasive +1 strength. We also got more evasive characters with Fidget Radigan's Henchman, Minnie Mouse Wide-Eyed Diver, and Donald Duck Not Again. Minnie is a shift 2 that gains +2 lore when you play a second action in a turn. Right now there aren't enough actions that are both cheap and impactful enough for Minnie to see much play, but as time goes by and more cards are released, eventually there might be a deck that pops up revolving around Minnie and cheap actions. Donald Duck is not only evasive, but also introduces an identity in Ruby we didn't see in the first chapter, and I'll get to that in a minute, self-damage. Donald gets +1 lore for each 1 damage on him, and we'll talk about why that's not all that good shortly. Out of all of the evasive characters we got in Rise of the Floodborn though, without a doubt the most impactful has been Minnie Mouse Stylish Surfer. For the same reasons Pongo was the most impactful evasive character in Ruby for the first chapter, Minnie Mouse Stylish Surfer sees play in Rise of the Floodborn. She's a cheaper, inkable, evasive character that can quest for 2 until your opponent has an answer. Don't get distracted by Minnie's immaculate style. She's a real threat on board if not dealt with quickly because you'll have a difficult time challenging her, so unless you've got some removal up your sleeve, she's gonna hang 10. And by hang 10, I mean you have at most 10 turns before she quests for 20 lore on her own. Compared to Pongo, she loses 1 strength for 1 ink cost, but you're rarely challenging with your evasive characters anyway, so it's not really much of a loss. Being able to get a threat like her out on board a turn early adds that much more pressure to your opponent since you can start your race to 20 even earlier. As mentioned earlier, Maui Hero to All was a staple card in the first chapter because of his beefy stats and Reckless and Rush keywords. Reckless and Rush are both keywords we saw supported in Ruby during the first chapter, and in Rise of the Floodborn we see even more Ruby cards sporting them. Felicia Always Hungry and Tuk Tuk Wrecking Ball both have Reckless, and I think it makes one of them much less playable than the other. Formerly, Captain Hook Forceful Duelist was one of the best 1-drops in the game because of his ability to challenge for 3 strength. I think Felicia falls into the same category. She has Reckless, so you'll be forced to challenge the first thing your opponent leaves exerted, but with 3 strength, there aren't many things so early in the game that can survive her challenge. This, one way or another, slows down an aggressive opponent. If they play a card in quest with it, then they'll only do it once before Felicia banishes it, making sure it doesn't get any more value. If they decide not to exert their card because they don't want Felicia to banish them, then they aren't doing anything for a few turns and you're still slowing them down. For Felicia, Reckless isn't the worst keyword because she's cheap and you can basically treat her like a cheap removal card. Tuk Tuk, on the other hand, really suffers from this keyword. Not only is Tuk Tuk uninkable, but I think the idea here is that his stats are a little boosted for having the Reckless keyword. Unfortunately, I don't think that's enough for Tuk Tuk to be worth playing. Even at 5 willpower, if he survives the first challenge, your opponent can try to banish him with a character they don't mind losing instead of giving you the choice on who to banish the next turn. Tuk Tuk not being able to progress your win condition for such an expensive card that's also uninkable is just too much in my opinion. Even if you try pairing him with a card like Sheer Con, unless you're playing cards that force your opponent to exert their cards, your opponent can choose to only exert cards they don't mind getting challenged by Tuk Tuk. Then Tuk Tuk is exerted and your opponent can retaliate. On the other hand, we also saw some new rush cards in Ruby like Queen of Hearts, Impulsive Ruler, Mulan Soldier in Training, and the previously mentioned Scar Vicious Cheater. Queen of Hearts Impulsive is not only a good 2-drop character because she's inkable and doesn't have bad stats, but also because she makes a pretty good shift target for Queen of Hearts Sensing Weakness. You can't shift Queen of Hearts Sensing weakness efficiently on turn 2 or anything, but you can still shift her on turn 3, which is pretty good for a 5 ink character. Mulan Soldier in Training unfortunately suffers a little bit more. Similar to Tuk Tuk, Mulan being uninkable really puts the nail in the coffin due to all the other uninkable cards in Ruby, not to mention the other ink you're paired with, that are generally just better cards. When you can only fit so many uninkable cards in your deck, Mulan is one of the first to be cut. I hate it because I like the card and I love the art. The stats aren't bad for a 4-cost character with Rush, but I guess Ravensburger thought it'd be too strong if the card was inkable as well. Another strategy we actually saw a lot of in the first chapter was Lore Drain. Both Aladdin cards saw lots of play, and we also had Rapunzel letting down her hair, as well as Tangle, which didn't see as much. In Rise of the Floodborn, it didn't get expanded on very much, but it did get a really interesting card. First, we got Lady Tremaine Overbearing Matriarch, which isn't all that special. She's 1 ink cheaper than Aladdin Street Rat with the condition that your opponent must have more lore than you before they lose any, and she's uninkable. She's technically a shift target for Lady Tremaine Imperious Queen, but you aren't usually looking to play her early, and if you run both, that's extra uninkables in the deck that aren't really needed. The card I'm most interested in is Honest John, Not That Honest. He has an ability that says whenever you play a Floodborn character, each opponent loses 1 lore. These cards that care about Floodborn cards being played excite me because the longer this game goes on, the more options they'll have to be built around, and there's already a ton of good Floodborn cards you can put in a deck with this and benefit from Honest John's ability. I personally like the idea of doubling down on the lore drain by playing Honest John and using Aladdin Heroic Outlaw to trigger his effect while also draining lore with Aladdin. Finally, the last theme we see in Ruby, which was actually introduced in Rise of the Floodborn, is one revolving around self-damage or cards that want to be damaged. Cards like What Did You Call Me, Sword in the Stone, and Dinner Bell all care about the damage on a character. For Sword in the Stone, your character gets an extra strength for each 1 damage, and for Dinner Bell, you draw cards equal to the damage on your character, then banish it. Admittedly, both What Did You Call Me and Sword in the Stone don't see much play because generally combat tricks and cards that boost the strength of other cards don't see play since they're only good in specific situations, take some setup, and often you're 2-for-1 trading into your opponent. Dinner Bell also doesn't see much play now, both because of it being uninkable and just how expensive the card is to activate. It requires some setup and costs at least 6 ink to draw some cards. The more exciting cards in this strategy, in my opinion, are Teeth and Ambitions, Mother Gothel, Withered and Wicked, and Donald Duck Not Again. Teeth and Ambitions has seen a lot of play and is a large part in why many decks have completely switched from playing generic 2/2 1-drops to 1/3 1-drops. With Teeth and Ambitions, you can play it on turn 2 in order to damage your 1/3, then banish another character with 2 willpower. The card's also a song and inkable, so there isn't much of a downside outside of having to damage your character, and sometimes that's actually something you're happy to do. Mother Gothel has a high stat line for 2 ink at 3 strength and 4 willpower, but she enters play with 3 damage, making her a 3/1. This is the perfect card to set up with Rapunzel gifted with healing because for 6 ink, only needing 2 cards, and both of them being inkable, you can draw 3 cards and develop 4 strength, 9 willpower, and 3 lore worth of stats on board. Mother Gothel also is an easy target for any other cards that care about healing cards with an added benefit. And after that, we have Donald Duck, which is the build around card for this strategy. He has evasive and gets +1 lore for each damage on him, meaning at most he could quest for 5 if he had 4 damage counters. Admittedly, this isn't the most consistent way of gaining lore because as a common card for the same cost, we have Ray that also has evasive and always quests for 3 lore. But Donald Duck definitely synergizes with cards like Teeth and Ambitions and can be a really fun deck to build around if this playstyle is something that interests you. And after all of that, I believe we've gone over most of the themes, identities, and strategies that Ruby has to offer. It's a very bold, brutal, and punishing ink to play between evasives that can steal the game away, characters that steal lore and banish other characters, and others that have Rush and Reckless to take advantage of opponents that are vulnerable. If any of the strategies or cards mentioned in this video resonate with you, I highly suggest checking out the ink and exploring some of it more. Let me know in the comments below if there were any that stood out or if there are any Ruby decks you've built and are trying to master. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it or found it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more. I have a bunch of other videos covering the other inks and how they changed or evolved in Rise of the Floodborn, and more that I'll be releasing soon, so don't miss those. Most importantly, don't forget to take care of yourself. My name is Brandon, also known as B Squared. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.